as Sophia was introducing, like what I wanted to kind of do with today's talk is just kind of put some of my disciplinary framework around how I think about reading a book like Grand Rapids Grassroots to hopefully kind of give you all something to kind of take with you as you work through the readings in that book, and hopefully being able to use that to kind of think about the kind of spaces and communities that you operate within. So that's kind of my goal with this. Plus, there's coffee and cookies, and it's just really hard to say no to Sophia when she asks you to do something. So that's how I ended up here today in here. And so Grand Rapids Grassroots, when I read that anthology, to me it's a book about local communities, local places and experiences, and people working within those communities to particularly affect change around them. And so that's what I want to do, is kind of bring in some of the disciplinary focus from anthropology to kind of think about that. And so I'm going to introduce a few concepts. We'll look at applying them in a couple sort of ways here locally to Grand Rapids, which is the theme of the book and the common read this year. And hopefully that kind of helps you kind of think about your own readings from that. So the first concept is this idea of agency, which social scientists love, the idea of agency, which in a very sort of brief definition is this ability to make independent choices and to sort of act upon those choices in here. And so when we think about activism, that's individual agents trying to sort of exercise their agency in a context in here. So that's one concept I kind of want to start with. So I got a little thought exercise for all of you to try to make this as sort of interactive as possible here. And so I just want you to kind of take an inventory of where you would rate your own agency in here. One being, I am completely dependent upon everything else, and I rarely am able to act upon my own choices or desires. 10 being, I am an agent, and I have lots of agency and an ability to affect sort of and act upon those choices and desires. So just take a second and try to think about where you end up on that scale of agency, I guess. All right, I've been told that good pedagogy is I give 30 seconds for you to formulate an answer in here. So just shout out, just give me a number. Where do you land on that? Just shout out a number here. 6. Can I get higher than a 6? 8? 7? All right, so I'm going to pick on the provost, who's the highest number here. All right. Yep. All right, Dr. Jones, what did you have for breakfast today? Cereal. What was in the cereal? Frosted mini, that sounds delicious, actually.
For our audience who, they just handed me a microphone. So what was in my cereal, Dillon asked what I had for breakfast, or excuse me, Dr. Carr asked what I had for breakfast. I said cereal. That was oat milk, or non-dairy milk, and frosted mini wheats.
That sounds delicious. I'm glad you had breakfast. I do this exercise in class, and my students don't eat breakfast. So like I was doing this one semester, and the students like, I had a cigarette for his breakfast. So you're doing better than that in here. So oat milk. So you live around here. How do you grow your sort of oats during the winter months?
Oh, as you know, Dillon, my day job is provost, not farmer. So
okay, so you didn't grow your own
no.
oats, and so I assume you didn't make your frosted mini wheats.
I wish I knew how, but what Kellogg's is putting in that box is far better.
So you didn't have free choice in what you exactly went for breakfast. It's what at the grocery store has available for you. In there. So
yes.
How'd you get to campus today?
I drove my car.
I've always wanted to make my own car. How'd you do it?
Okay. Yes, I relied on what was available at a dealership.
But at least, so I had a colleague up at Lake State. He always joked when his students get kind of, I'd have to do this. Like, hey, it beats raking concrete. So how was it making the road that you drove in on?
Pretty decent.
It's decent, yeah. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to ask you, did you do anything for yourself yet today? I'm just kidding. But it's a good illustration.
Keep asking questions, Dillon. I'll answer them.
All right. That's good. We'll stop picking on the provost now for a little bit. And so we get into this tension here within social science theory between another concept, which is structure. And so most social theorists working with any form of culture change is always trying to work within this tension of agency and structure. And then partly in American society, we have this illusion as part of our cultural attitudes that we are these independent, pulled myself up from the bootstraps, which I sewed myself out of it. And so we have a tendency to kind of think about things as sense of individual autonomy and agency. And there's, again, you could work on the extremes here. So you can go on to an American sort of individualism sort of extreme, which is I am making all these independent choices myself fully, or you could end up on the very structural end of it, which is agency is this illusion that we're all working within choices that are constrained by structures that have provided things for us. That I might feel like I chose a breakfast, but really it's whatever the economic structures that brought a product to market that's provided for me that has provided me with that constrained set of choice in here. And so that's really the tension that we have to work with, particularly when we talk about social patterns, though. That tension becomes even a little bit more important. That when we can think about something tangible like breakfast, it's one thing. When we start talking about sort of more intangible structures in our life, stuff like our social roles and our identities, the communities that we operate within, our sort of social institutions and economic institutions and political institutions, our educational institutions that we're sitting in here, that we have choice. But those choices are structured for us by these reoccurring social patterns. That's what I mean by structure in here. And so what's the actual nature of choice and what's the actual sort of role of structures in our lives? And when you encounter structures that might be problematic, that's what activism attempts to work at and change in here. And so that's kind of the enduring social theory that I draw from as I kind of read a book like Grand Rapids Grassroots in here. So as an anthropologist, I'm both interested in both the individual decision making and the way in which people perform agency, but I'm also interested in social patterns and structures that are affecting people's choices and sort of guide people's behaviors in their day-to-day lives. And so we want to try to work through both of those as we think about our local community here in Grand Rapids in here. The other issue is structures that, as abstract as they may be, become outsized in importance in terms of social science research, in part because structures have some profound effects upon our lives. In fact, whether you like it or not, and as abstract as the concept may be, a structure will kill you, which is why we have a term called structural violence that Paul Farmer has coined in here. And structures can affect us in so many different ways. I got a picture of a world-famous building up here in here. Does anybody recognize this historically significant building? No. This is the Union Carbide plant in Bhopal, India, which was the site of one of the world's worst industrial disasters, which the plant had a safety valve fail, released this huge cloud of toxic gas that settled into essentially a shanty town that had sprung up in the shadows of the factory. And in the middle of the night, several thousand people ended up getting gassed to death. And let me ask you this: how many of you would buy a house downwind from a toxic chemical factory? Nobody, right? Like, so who lives there? Can't afford, or in our academic terminology, people that lack significant agency in that context. And we recognize that different people in different social positions have different amounts of agency in there. In the case of Indian society, which is a very sort of hierarchical caste-based society, individuals that essentially are born into a lower rank subordinate caste in India are disproportionately positioned in places that are much more vulnerable and dangerous in here. Not because of who they are as an individual, not because of how hard they want to work or how industrious they are, but by virtue of what socially constructed pattern they happen to be born into an Indian society. And this is true for most state societies. Any sort of strong centralized society will have some form of hierarchy because we have social structures in place, which is why we pay attention to these as anthropologists in here. All right, so if we can think about the same structures that affect both American society and our own day-to-day experiences here in Grand Rapids, we can look at the way in which access to everything that came up in the box up there, which we would all pretty well agree upon as a basic set of human rights. That we would say that everybody should have some sort of access or opportunities, and we recognize that that's not equitably distributed because of structures in here. And so opportunity is one of these. And so there's a map of these are non-metro poverty, but these are counties in the United States that have high levels of poverty, where over 20% of the residents in those counties live below the federal poverty rate. So not talking about urban poverty, this is primarily rural poverty. But look at here, is when we look at this, there's some very distinct geographic clusterings of persistent poverty areas within the United States. And so this is not a random distribution, but this is a product of social patterns or social structures in here. And so we have this cluster of high poverty counties in the Deep South that are also predominantly African American counties in here. So what could have possibly happened in American history where we get a concentration of high African American residents and high poverty in the Deep South, do you think? Slavery and the subsequent effect of Jim Crow in here. It's not a random occurrence, but this is a sort of an enduring lived experience today that's built upon sort of the historical experience legacy. We have the Appalachians and Ozarks, where you have high poverty and high Irish American ancestry, and so the history of the Irish in the United States, since we just had St. Patrick's Day with indentured servitude, is, if you understand your history of whiteness, is that the Irish did not become white until the early 1900s as a result of other historical factors. We have counties with high Hispanic residents and poverty in West Texas and New Mexico. And then these turquoise counties here are literally the poorest counties in the entire United States. We're talking about unemployment rates upwards of 60%, people not having access to even running water in some cases or paved roads. And these are predominantly Native American reservations. And so whatever could possibly happen in American history where we get a concentration of the indigenous peoples of Americas in extremely high poverty contexts. And again, these are not random, but these are products of what we call structures. And it endures. And so I hear a lot of people sometimes will talk about, well, if I was in this context, this is what I would do to get out of this. And you're assuming that they have the same agency in their life as somebody else may or may not have. In here. And so we can see one symptom of this is the persistence of it. And so if you were born into a high poverty county in 1969, chances are in 2009, with the most recent sort of set of data I have with this, you're probably living in a high poverty county in the United States, not because of who you are as an individual, not because of how hard you want to work, not because of how much agency you want to exercise, but by virtue of what socially constructed patterns you happen to find yourself into in American society. That's the importance of thinking about structures. Not only would you be living in terms of lack of opportunity, but being poor will take years off your life, and morbidly, we can actually quantify that. And so this is some health data here that shows that as you reach zip codes with that approximate the federal poverty line, we get a precipitous decline in the life expectancy of people that live within those particular zip codes. And so your life expectancy, if you live in the most affluent zip codes here in the United States, is upwards of 85 years. Women live a little bit longer than men. But once you get towards the federal poverty rate, that declines fairly quickly in here. So being poor will take 15 years off of your life, which is a morbid calculation, but that's what makes insurance rates go. Not only will you live a shorter life, but probably that life experience will be more morbid. So lack of equal access to health care, lack of economic opportunity is another sort of pattern. Lack of legal protection is another one in here. How many of you smoke dope? I'm just kidding. You don't have to answer that question. You're professionals. So usually my students is 1 in 5, and you can easily tell which student it is in here. So I don't even, is that the right term, dope? No. It's like that's how. All right. Or marijuana use in here. So if we look at 18 to 25-year-olds, which are remarkably honest in these surveys here, is that they'll report their marijuana use in here. And so what we see is that slightly, right around 25% of people with African American ancestry will report using marijuana. Slightly more than that with European or white kids will use sort of marijuana at about 30% in here. But if you look at the actual arrest rates for marijuana possession, we see a very stark disparate experience in here. And so with this is even though white kids are using it at a slightly higher rate than black kids, is that they're far less likely to get sort of arrested for marijuana possession in here, in contrast to kids from a different social location in here. And there's a different cultural attitudes around it. So if you're the kid driving around the suburbs in your parents' minivan and you got a joint on you, the cops are going to pull you over. They might pocket that for their use later on, and you have a future ahead of you, and so they're going to run you through the system to, or not run you through, but bring you to your parents, and they're going to set you straight. You got a future ahead of you, and that's how they're going to work it out. If you're the black kid walking down the inner city and you get pulled over or stopped and you have a joint on you, then all of a sudden that's a gateway drug to life of hardened crime, and we're going to let the system straighten you out in here. So there's disparate experiences in terms of how people encounter the legal system, in terms of who is and who isn't policed in certain ways in here, and that has very disparate outcomes in terms of people experience, not because of who you are, but by virtue of social structures that pattern in our day-to-day lives. So all I'm doing is illustrating for you the effects of that. And in fact, we can see that when we talked about, we were talking about this beforehand with the protests in Ferguson, Missouri after Michael Brown's shooting, which really kind of thrust Black Lives Matter into the American consciousness. It really wasn't specifically about Michael Brown's shooting. That was really where the frustration was. And what has really come out is that really there's been a long history of sort of what the Justice Department declared as illegal searches and seizures by the city of Ferguson, where they were using really aggressive policing tactics to secure fines and forfeitures to basically balance their city budget, because they ran them through a district court where that money would go into essentially the city budget. And so we can look at the policing data based upon sort of social categories in here. And so in Ferguson, despite the fact that only 63% of the local population was African American, that's something like 90% of the traffic stops were of African American motorists, in contrast with 30% of the white residents in Ferguson, accounting for just under 10% in here, even though the fact that when we look at contraband hit rate, white motorists, when stopped and searched, actually were more likely to have contraband on them than motorists of other social backgrounds in here. I'm not sure like it happened here. I think the one native dude in town got pulled over 8 times that year. That's what the data is suggesting in here. So that's just illustrating for you the effect of these patterns and how they sort of come about, or not how they come about, but the effect of structures and why they're important to look at. The next thing we want to kind of look at then is some of the social theory around how these patterns come about and persist, and that gives us some insight in terms of how we can think about working within and hopefully affecting change on them. And in fact, Dr. Seuss made a good living on pointing this basic fact out. So one of my old students gave me this book because some stuff that we covered in class kind of hinged upon it. My kids love this book, by the way, and it's a really good illustration of this concept of us and them, which is academic, even though it sounds more Dr. Seuss than otherwise, but us and them is essentially the academic terminology for this, the recognition that we have social structures and our social groups that we identify with us, but as a result of basic human sort of psychology, we end up with thems or others as well. And that was the theme of the Butter Battle book. If anybody's familiar with it, if not, we have a room full of librarians. They can hook you up, I bet. In here. And so what it was is the Zooks and the Ukes, and the one difference between us and them was essentially what side of the butter do you butter. So do you butter with your butter side up or the butter side down, which seems very simplistic, but what Dr. Seuss kind of points out is that people manufacture difference in here. And that's very consistent with anthropological theory in here. So I'm not going to some of you don't eat butter for breakfast. Some of you have frosted mini wheats. But I'm not asking which side you butter your bread, but think about the social locations that you feel that you inhabit. Think about the us's in your life. in here. So just take a second, think of 3 examples of an us that you would identify with. So all sorts of identities, and we all maintain multiples of these. And then select one of your us's and think of an example of what you do to build up a sense of us. And then to have an us, you also have to them. So think about what you might do to mark the difference between us and them in here. So just take a second to think about that. Anybody want to share an us? Which I've already picked on the provost. So everybody's like, I'm not touching this one of the 10-foot pole. All right, we can pick on the new guy now.
How about sports allegiances?
That's a great one, absolutely.
I'm from Wisconsin, so my us is Packer fans.
Yes, I did my undergrad in La Crosse, Wisconsin, but I'm from the UP as a Lions fan. I've experienced that firsthand, and Packer fans are the most irrational people on earth in here.
Not true. How many Lombardis?
But when I was in La Crosse, like there was literally one other Lions fan in the entire town, and he had a Lions jacket on, and we would just routinely bump into each other downtown La Crosse now and again. Like there's no reason that we should even say hi to each other, but it'd be like, hey, like in part because of that sort of affinity in here. And so we have strong senses of us. There's rituals that people do. Sort of having done firsthand ethnographic work in Wisconsin, is that the Packer fans have this weird ritual where they'll put cheese on their head in here, and that builds up a sense of solidarity with each other in here. And so that also serves as a boundary marker to distinguish us from them. So awesome example with that in here. And so that's another kind of lighthearted way to maybe think about sort of another sort of anthropological concept or even social theory concept, which is the idea of ethnic group and ethnicity. And in effect, based on how we would define those terminologies, sports allegiance operates the exact same way that ethnicity does. You're just marking it with a different sense in here. And so that's an easier one to go on. I didn't even start talking about Michigan and Ohio State, which that one can get contentious in here. So basically, when we sort of define these terms here up here, we have ethnic group. And what we're talking about essentially is a group of people that are essentially claiming some distinct identity together. And this is usually based upon some sense of shared characteristics. And then ethnicity then becomes the essentially way in which that's performed outward, sort of the extent to which it's sort of magnified, how attachment people have upon this, because you can have people that are member of a group, and the extent to which the performance of that ethnicity is sort of variable. And one thing that we tend to miss that's very classic anthropologically sort of speaking is that we also have a tendency to view groups like this as very homogenous, but there's actually not. There's quite a bit of variability in terms of individual performance and experience in it, but it's still a useful way to kind of think about how structural patterns come about and how people actually experience them in here. So why have ethnicity? So there's some really great benefits of ethnicity because it ties you to other people in very profound ways. That you can feel connected to people, whether you're cheering for your sports team or whether people have the same sense of religious practice or they cook the same types of food, which is comfortable, or have the same language, the same dress, same customs. Culture is a comforting thing. And so being in a space where you know your behaviors are not only meaningful to you, but are mutually meaningful to other people is something that is very necessary for human beings. And so that's what ethnicity does for us. It ties you to groups of people and builds up that shared sense of camaraderie and trust, which is extraordinarily valuable. But one thing I remember James Scott pointing this out in one of his books, looking at sort of the formation of ethnicity, ethnogenesis, and what we often find is that it's in contexts where there's struggle as well. So it's not that you have ethnic identities and then people look for resources or access to struggle over. And he points out oftentimes those are sort of formed in the context of struggle over access. And so as you have a societal context where people have disparate access to resources, people struggle over control and access to those resources. And what we find then is identities form around that give you a shared sense of connection with other people around those in here. So it becomes very sort of linked to these categories of structural patterns and structural inequalities that we looked at in here. And so what we find occurring then, whether it's ethnicity, whether it's sports allegiance, or any other of these kind of us's in here, is that people end up doing two things simultaneously. One of which is the sense of building up a camaraderie or a sense of us through these strategies of inclusion. And then by definition, to have an us, you also have to have a them. So you need an exclusionary practice where you're marking boundaries between others as well. And so ethnic groups will create origin myths, we have rituals, we have festivals, we have holidays where people are performing these senses of us, whether they attribute to those on a day-to-day basis or not. What did we just have yesterday? St. Patrick's Day, where everybody all of a sudden puts on green and becomes Irish all of a sudden. Carr is actually Irish, but I didn't put any green on in here. And so in part because you could argue it's a terribly sort of ethnocentric holiday because it just tells what the rest of you think of us Irish, that we're just gonna drink a bunch of green beer and get irresponsible in here. And so that we have these characters that sort of come about it in here, but people that will essentially, that it doesn't affect their day-to-day experience of who they are, all of a sudden start performing their sense of Irishness in some way, shape, or form. I used to live on the northeast side, sort of down in Midtown, and one of the weirdest experiences was late September, like trying to come home, and all of a sudden there's barricades everywhere. I'm like, what's going on here? And then somebody's like, hey, it's Pulaski Days. I'm like, Pulaski, what? I've never heard of this in here. And everybody all of a sudden becomes Polish in sort of Grand Rapids for like 1 week of the year in here. So even though sort of it doesn't sort of factor into your day-to-day life or experience in one shape or form, all of a sudden during this 1 week a year, because you have a festival and a shared tradition, people now start accentuating their sense of who they are in terms of this performance sense. And it builds up this camaraderie or connection of who us is in here. So that's when ethnicity goes well. And we can think about this from any different category we have in here. And what it does for us is not only promote solidarity, but it creates what we would describe as imagined communities, that you feel connected to members of the in-group that you have some form of affinity for. But by definition, you have to have a marker or a boundary, which is a them, which is the sort of the other. And so whether that's language, dialect, or sort of the fact that we can use dress and traditions or where you're going to worship, or the food you're eating as a marker for them. And so everybody does both of those simultaneously. And so we have this sort of inherent preference for us's. And when it goes well, what we're existing in is these imagined communities. And so most of the sort of literature on imagined community really came out of a lot of Benedict Anderson's work around nation states. So I'm going to use this, even though this is a very big scale kind of sense, but these performances of imagined communities works in local scales as well, of what we're going to be hopefully coming back to talk to in Grand Rapids here. And so the modern nation state imagines itself to be limited and sovereign, and what distinguishes it from of non-modern states in the sense of the social science literature is the idea that we have both a state, which is a formal political boundary, and we have a shared sense of common identity, nationality, which is why we have the hyphenated nation state. So the idea is not only do you belong to the same political apparatus together, but we share a common identity wrapped up on top of that. That's essentially what the premise behind the nation state is. And it creates this sense of belonging and camaraderie to all members of the nation or national community that has it. And so it has to be limited and sovereign. So there's got to be a firm boundary because you have to have an us and you have to have a them. I'm not sure what this person is doing if they go to their living room, they're Canadian, they're sort of kitchen, they're American. And so we build up these senses of camaraderie of who we are, and we have negative others as well. How many of you have ever told a Canadian joke? Nobody wants to admit it. I went to grad school in Canada, so I know all of them. And don't worry, Canadians will tell American jokes too. And so it works both ways, and everybody does this. And same thing, we all have sort of these stereotypical ideas of how the Germans are like and how the French are like. I'm in a German documentary carrying a mummy into the university in Western Ontario, and we had like an after party with the documentary crew, and they thought I was Canadian. I can pass as Canadian, eh? And then they found out I'm American, and they start treating you different. And everybody's first question is, do you own a gun? I'm like, no. In here. And so that's how other countries think of us. And where does that come from? Well, we have so much of our lived experience together that builds up this sense of who we are, that we've all gone through really a standardized set of American experiences that build up our sense of Americanness. And that's really profound. And it's really, once you get outside the States, that it doesn't really sort of recognize when it sort of creeps up. In here. Has anybody ever been outside the United States and bumped into another American? What's that experience like? All right, we can shift the focus. Have you ever been outside the state of Michigan and bumped into somebody else from the state of Michigan? What's the first thing you do? Do you know how weird this looks to other states? This is like the most awkward handshake. And I'm from the UP, so I'm already been othered because now I got to put a second hand up there. And then you start calling each other names, troll, youper, and everybody else is like, what is going on here? But it's that sense of commonality in here. And then everybody does this, whether it's at the national level or state level. You try to find the one person you know in common. Like, oh, where are you from? Flint. Hey, do you know such and such? No. Do you know such and such? No. Statistically, the chances of knowing somebody is extraordinarily small, but we still want to go through that sort of sense of thing. And it doesn't really matter at that point. You're like, this is awesome. Let's go pick on the Packer fans together. And it creates that sense of sort of Michiganderness that really feels like an interconnection in here. And the same thing happens if you're out overseas and you bump into another American. You're like, this is awesome. Let's speak American here. Let's go get a cheeseburger together. It doesn't matter if you would bump into those person in the United States, you probably would not even give them the time of day. But the fact that you're in some foreign country together all of a sudden creates that sense of connection or commonality or community, which is what we call an imagined camaraderie. That's what we mean by an imagined community. So it's like, oh man, where are you from? They're like New Mexico. You're like, that's awesome. And I've heard some incredible stories in my time sort of doing this in class. And like one student said, oh yeah, we bumped into this other American couple. Her and her boyfriend were backpacking across Europe, and they spent like the next 3 days hanging out together with this couple backpacking simply because they're just Americans. And the incredible part is my student was in her early 20s. The couple they were hanging out with were retirees in like their early 60s. They should not be hanging out other than the fact that they were Americans in some foreign country and felt connected together. And why do we feel that camaraderie? Well, in the sense of our Americanness, it's because we've shared all of these experiences together. That we've all gone through media experiences. We've experienced world events through the same lens. Something's happening in the world, we want to know like how it's affecting us Americans. Like a tsunami will hit, we want to know the 3 Americans whose flights were delayed. And so we're processing world events through how it affects our in-group or us in here. Public education, you've all been lied to the same way together in terms of our origin myths, which are necessary for any one of these types of identities and groups. For instance, who's this dude right here? All right. What's he doing? What day is it? There we go. This is good. Everybody knows the contours of the story here. And so we all have our shared sense of origin. If I hang two lanterns in the bell or the tower, what does it mean? The British are coming by sea, and then Paul Revere, like, even though, like, in reality, like, Paul Revere never made it past, like, the first tavern, but it's still part of our shared origin myths, that we all have been sort of told the same. And we got to forget the bad parts. So we all sort of dress up like Native Americans when you force your third graders. When I was young, that's what you do. And then, oh, we have this great sort of feast together, and then we'll just ignore all the atrocities we've done to the indigenous peoples of the United States because we want to ignore them and move on in here. And so we have to have these holidays and public rituals to build up an origin myth, and you got to forget the national atrocities together. And that builds up that shared sense of connection. And so when it goes well, that's what makes you feel connected to some random American when you bump into them overseas. And the same thing with Michigan history, we've done the same thing. And so wherever you happen to build up our us's, that's how the process works in here. All right. So that's some more anthropological theory. We have tension between agency and structure. We have the idea of sort of our shared sense of community, and we use ethnicity and ethnic groups as sort of a theoretical model for thinking about that. We can take both those theories now and return our focus back to Grand Rapids. And we can think about social boundaries, structural patterns, and the role of communities and the other in here. And so we think about what social boundaries we maintain in here. And so schools is a really good way in which we sort of do this in here. And so how many of you, when you were in high school, would say the majority of your friends were from the high school you went to? Why is that? It's mechanical. Like, you see these people every day for 8 hours a day. It's just going to be your social group. So schools are kind of forced, but we have these elements of ethnicity within our schools. All of you have a fight song. You all have senses of who the mascot was from your school. You had school colors in here. You might have a slight little origin myths. We all have the other. You had the rival school in here. And so all of these elements that we were just talking about can be formed out in sort of our school system in here. And then you bump into somebody who went to your high school like 10 years before you, and all of a sudden you feel an imagined camaraderie with them. Oh, that's awesome. And you try to figure out the one librarian you had in common in here. And so that's essentially how schools sort of operate with that. So who you go to school with matters because that provides a peer group or a social group that you operate. So a number of years ago, I was doing a research talk on campus. So I pulled a pile of educational data from the National Center for Educational Statistics. I'm not from Grand Rapids, so this is how I get to know town, as I pull a bunch of data and sort of analyzing it. And this is for elementary school data within the city of Grand Rapids, which you have a couple schools that are predominantly Black students, a couple schools that are predominantly Hispanic students, and a few that would be a majority of white students here, which when I looked at this data here, you actually got quite a few of these elementary schools that have sort of a mixture of people from different sort of ethnic backgrounds in here, which I thought was pretty nice, and it wasn't fitting with how people were talking about sort of the city of Grand Rapids. But we can also say that obviously not every social network has the same underlying structural advantages or in case of opportunities or agency in here. And so we can actually correlate that with other data around free and reduced lunch, which is a good proxy measure for the underlying poverty rate for the neighborhood that elementary school is drawn from. And so as the percentage of white students increases, the percentage of students receiving free and reduced lunch is declining. And there's a pretty strong correlation of 0.71. So you stats fans out there know that this is explaining quite a bit of variability within this regression here. And so we're talking about two separate social worlds based upon sort of the underlying sort of opportunity in here. But still, there is quite a few schools within the Grand Rapids public school system that has quite a few sort of mixture of people from different ethnic backgrounds, which I thought was pretty good. But I'm looking at this data. I was also looking at census data at the same time I'm doing this analysis, and something wasn't quite sitting right with me because Grand Rapids as a town is a majority white city. And when you look at the overall N value for different demographic categories, is that there should be really a large number of sort of school-age kids with European ancestry, but the total N here really wasn't matching up. But then I realized when you download stuff from sort of the federal databases, you got to make sure you're checking all your right boxes. And so this is just public school elementary data, so I had to rerun it with the private school elementary data for just the city of Grand Rapids. And you get a much different sort of experience in terms of what's going on. And so when you put all these pieces together, we actually see a much more complete picture of the city of Grand Rapids, where there's a few schools that have some degree of admixture, but for the most part, is the white students go to school with each other, the black students go to school with each other, and Hispanic students go to school with each other. And these kids are not getting free reduced lunch because their parents are actually paying extra money to sort of send them to school. I'm not going to begrudge where anybody goes to school. All I'm doing is I'm illustrating an effect of these structural patterns. Because again, these end up being communities that you feel attached to and camaraderie with. And so if you feel this imagined camaraderie, this subconscious tendency to feel an affinity to somebody who's in group, and you have that imagined community of people who went to school with you, imagine how that patterns out when you get a job in here. And like, oh man, hey, you went to my high school. And all of a sudden you feel a connection to that candidate in here. And that has a slight little difference. Think about networking opportunities. If this is your peer group, peer groups have value in the sense that they help get you jobs. But if you're coming from a peer group that has one set of existing economic disadvantage, what kind of jobs are going to get? They'll help you get into their factory that a family member might be in. Over here, where these kids are paying for extra tuition, they're going to get you that killer internship at their dad's company. And so we see some of the mechanisms now of persistent inequalities, structural inequalities that come about, and they actually are not necessarily anything that anybody's engineering, but they're actually a product of these small little recursive daily practices over and over and over again that play out every day in these very subtle ways in our lives in here. So who you go to school with matters because it shapes for you your social networks and your social worlds that become the communities in which you operate within, and that most of us aren't really thinking too hard about the effect upon those communities in terms of our day-to-day experiences. Chances are, if you didn't have friends from your school, the rest of your friends probably grew up in the neighborhood that you were sort of living in. So who you live next to also matters like this. And so this is 2010 census data down to the census tract. So if we look at where the African-American population in the city of Grand Rapids is, predominantly southeast Grand Rapids, adjacent parts of Kentwood, and another enclave up in northeast Grand Rapids around the historic Auburn Hills sort of development that was up there. There we go. Latino residents within Grand Rapids, southwest Grand Rapids, adjacent parts of Wyoming, and adjacent parts of northwest Grand Rapids. And this is people with European ancestry, which is everywhere else in here as well. And so this really maps out for us then where people are living. And we see that it patterns out pretty consistently with sort of ethnic background in here, which technically is illegal, but that's how it works out in terms of our day-to-day experience. And in sort of our recursive daily habits that we're really not thinking too hard about, where we're shopping, how we're getting to campus, where we're going to school, all those small little micro decisions pattern out within these social boundaries and social patterns in our day-to-day lives in here. And so this is sort of a zooming in on southeast Grand Rapids here. So this is the traditional African-American neighborhood within Grand Rapids, south of Wealthy, north of Hall and Jefferson, east of Division, west of Fuller Avenue. In here, and we can see a very stark boundaries. In fact, if you look at census data across the United States, this is one of the most sharpest social boundaries anywhere in the United States, which is right here. And so if you're not done so, go to Hall and Division and start walking east, and you're going to see black people, black people, black people, black people. You're going to cross an imaginary line, which we call Fuller Avenue in this city, and within 2 blocks, you're going to start seeing white people, white people, white people, white people in a very, very short period of time in here. Again, this is illegal to do, and how does it get maintained? Well, housing becomes one big mechanism of this within American society. So if we look at the median household income, we see an inversion here, and this is what allows people to lock others out of access to your neighborhoods. Because you need a certain median household income to afford housing in a particular neighborhood. So if you grow up in a neighborhood like this with a low median household income, that social network is going to provide you one set of opportunities, which persist across generation, as the data I showed earlier shows. If you grow up in another neighborhood that has a different median household income, that provides you with a different network with a different set of opportunities. Arguably, some people would say, well, I'm exercising my agency of choice, but those choices are constrained by social patterns and social boundaries that we occupy and exist within. And so, which is why everybody's really, really sort of obsessive over house prices in the United States in here. Anytime I see very stark breaks in any sort of social data, it always gives me a pause as an analyst. And so if we look here, we see this break down here, like why is there a limit there? We can think about how you move through the cityscape of Grand Rapids. So if you have access to reliable automobile transportation, you can drive, you have access to certain places to apply for jobs, certain places to look for housing, certain places to go to school and that type of stuff in here. Whereas if you have to use public transportation to move through a cityscape, you're much more restricted in those, and that affects then your choice in here. Not because of who you are as an individual, not how much agency you want to exercise, but has a product of kind of enduring types of experiences in here. And so that's another limiting factor that comes in here. So even who you're shopping alongside is not a random occurrence, but it's actually sort of patterned out for us in terms of who has access to those stores in here. I was doing this for a class a number of years ago, and we're talking about the differences between the Meijers on 28th Street, sort of the Kalamazoo Street Meijer, and the one past sort of the freeway, which I call the fake town Meijer. It's like they're trying to fake you out. Like there's a little, like, oh, it's a little town. Like, no, it's a Meijer. And like, in here. And so one student's like, yeah, my mom always feels like she's got to dress up a little bit more to go out to that Meijer. And so who you're even sort of buying food alongside is not a random occurrence in here, but is actually patterned out in a variety of subtle little ways that can be performed on a day in and day out basis, which is what we refer to as recursive practices in here. And they have some very profound effects because most of us have this illusion of agency in our lives, that we think that we're making these autonomous, free choices and decisions, and I have a desire and I can act upon my desire. When we think about it from a structural standpoint, we recognize that our decisions and our movements and our practices are constrained very heavily upon the existing social patterns in our lives. And when those constraints are obvious, like a physical barrier in front of you, people dig under them, climb over them, knock them down. They're extremely easy to break down when you see very overt signs of barriers in people's lives. But these subtle recursive habits, though, these create these illusionary walls that most of us aren't even consciously aware of their effect in terms of how they're influencing your day-to-day agency or choice. And because of that, because they're built into our reoccurring habits, which is what we call recursive behaviors. And here you're not thinking too hard about them. I'm just going to school. These are my friends because they're going to school with me. And these are my other friends because I grew up alongside of them. Those day-to-day decisions end up producing enduring effects. And when you're not subconsciously aware of them, you don't necessarily question or challenge them. And they have a much more enduring sense of lingering across time in here. And so I was sort of talking to a friend of mine like a number of years ago, and he lives over on the northwest side. And so I'm like, hey, you live in the old Lithuanian neighborhood. He's like, hey, my neighbor's Lithuanian. How'd you know? I'm like, I got a map in here. And so this is a map of Grand Rapids I found, which dates to about the 1930s. And this is northwest Grand Rapids here. So we have the Lithuanian neighborhood, which is distinct from the Holland neighborhood. We have another Polish neighborhood here, a Polish neighborhood here. You got to keep the Poles away from the Germans in here. And so this is not particularly a redlining map, but it's related to the concept of redlining, which is a very common practice in the 1930s in terms of who has access to different sort of neighborhoods in here. And so if you recognize all the Dutch neighborhoods in Grand Rapids are up on the hills because The Dutch are afraid of being below sea level, and so they look for the highest ground possible in here. And there's an us and them phenomenon that's working here. So as you emigrate to an area, you're not just going to look for any old place to go. You're going to go to a neighborhood that has the best food, that speaks your language, that has your social connections. So there's a pull, an inclusionary us that draws you to it. But simultaneously, there's also an exclusionary them that occurs with this. And that's what that idea of redlining was a subtle little nudging of structural factors that keep people from even moving into other neighborhoods if they want to pursue different opportunities or access to those structural inequalities that get built upon these in here. So again, we can think about Southeast Grand Rapids, which is a traditional African-American neighborhood in Grand Rapids. Why is that there? Well, simply because in the 1930s, that's where somebody decided to have all the colored folk live. That literally 80 to 90 years has gone by and nothing much has changed. I find that staggering. And that's the effect of these recursive daily practices over and over, like subtle little decisions of where do I shop? How do I move through a cityscape? Who I'm going to school with? Who ends up being in my social networks and my realities is not a random occurrence, nor is it a product of your pure, unrestrained agency on a day-to-day basis, but instead is built up on these enduring patterns and recursive practices that pattern out, and in a lot of cases end up perpetuating existing social inequalities that are built into the fabric of our society. And when you're not necessarily consciously aware of those little invisible walls of who you're not shopping with, who you're not going to school with, you're not necessarily sort of obviously aware of what that's happening in here. So taking all that theory now, we can bring it back to the Grand Rapids Grassroots book in terms of a book about local places, local communities, and then grassroots activism as people think about ways in which they can break out of those in here. And so I think about 3 takeaways that I have for this is one, just being able to be reflective upon your own implicit biases in our life, that we all have this psychological tendency to prefer and be comfortable around us. And that there's a psychological tendency to be uncomfortable in the face of others in here. And because of that, we gravitate to places that make us comfortable. What neighborhoods we live in, where we go to school, where we're shopping, what our hobbies happen to be, where our houses of worship happen to be. And those recursive daily practices shape for us identities in an inclusionary us that are great, but by definition, they also exclude others from your life that you're not necessarily being aware of. I do a thought exercise with my students. If you can drive through Grand Rapids and you have an automobile, you have a different set of access. And so if you have a job at, say, the Woodland Mall that starts at 3 o'clock every day, if you have able to drive, you can take one set of classes here at GRCC. But if you have to take public transportation and it takes an hour on the 6 to get out there, and I tell my students, like, what's the last time you can start a class at GRCC if you have to get to your job? And they're like, oh, it's like math. I'm in a social science class. I shouldn't be doing math. I'm like, we do lots of math. And they work it back and like, oh, I have to start my class by like literally 12 o'clock. So I tell my students, if you're having an afternoon class here on campus, look around you. There are people literally not sitting in a chair next to you that you're not going to go to class with simply by virtue of how you're able to move through a cityscape that's different than others. Those are those subtle little ways that affect sort of our lives. And so part of grassroots awareness is simply sort of paying attention. And then once you sort of recognize how those daily recursive habits are affecting who you're actually interacting with and who you're not interacting with, then that's when you have sort of an opportunity to make some intentionality to figure out which communities that you do want to expand your kind of social reach and awareness from. And that's essentially one of the premises between Grand Rapids Grassroots. And so that just kind of gives you a little bit of body of anthropological theory of how I kind of think about a reading like that in here. So we have this tension between our agency and structure. And we like to sort of emphasize our agency, but from an anthropological standpoint, we're really interested in not only structures, but how structures affect people's day-to-day experiences in terms of what structures you belong to, what are the inequalities built into those structures, and then we can think about how they get performed out in our lives on a day-to-day basis. We have identities, we form identities, we create these daily habits and practices that build up a strong sense of us, but by definition, to do that, you create others in your life. And if you're not being too reflexive about that, you're bumping into these illusionary walls all the time that are restricting people from having access to. And activism basically is recognizing those barriers and then trying to point them out to others, essentially. So, thank you.
Give Dr. Carr a round of applause, please. And so now, if you have questions, raise your hand and I will come bring the mic to you.
My question is like, what do we do about it? Because like I've moved around a lot. Like I've lived in Muskegon around like majority like black students, and like
Yeah.
honestly, my first time ever seeing like white kids and black kids play together is in Grand Rapids.
Yeah.
And so, but the boundary line is like very thick, and when you live in a place where they want you to pay 3 times the rent for an apartment,
Yeah.
it creates that thick boundary line to the point that it should be illegal. And then something that I've observed is like black kids in Grand Rapids don't get an opportunity to create an identity. At least in Detroit, we have like, okay, we go to school and then we go to a Coney Island.
Yeah.
They don't even have that here. And so it like kind of leads them to get into trouble because they don't have a sense of identity.
Mhm.
And so to the point that it should be illegal. And so
Yeah.
like, what do we do about it?
That is a phenomenal question. That's essentially, I think, one of the themes of the Grassroots book. And so one approach or strategy, obviously, is talking and pointing out and being very vocal about this. And like you're saying, is like, that's not right. And this is what I'm seeing is happening in here. And just being willing and able and having space to sort of constantly point it out. And when people ignore you, point it out to them again. And when they ignore you, point it out to them again. And that's why I think some of the chapters in the book really sort of emphasize that it's not an overnight sort of practice in there. Always, anytime I sort of talk about, oh, it's just take time, structures take a little bit to change. I always think of like sort of Martin Luther King's letter in terms of he's writing from Birmingham jail, saying like, I don't have time to kind of wait for the arc of justice to bend across there. Sort of the other sort of thing is making sure that sort of you're taking advantage of the opportunity to sort of get into other sort of communities to build up sort of allyship, to build up other resources that you can bring to kind of sort of deconstruct some of those sort of challenges. That creates people in awkward places though too. Where students that say, hey, I'm just going to go and take advantage of my opportunities and I'll come back to my communities and I'll work at sort of breaking some of those barriers down. But then sometimes that causes a lot of strain on individuals because now you end up with a foot in two separate worlds in here. And so then you're not part of one community, you're not necessarily part of another community. And individuals, and I think a lot of our sort of, I think, your talk from last week is a good illustration of that. People that are willing to keep feet in two separate worlds, they can affect change in here, but personally, it does have a cost in there. But if you're recognizing what those costs are, and you recognize the value of that's another sort of opportunity. Does that kind of answer your question? Great question.
Any other questions, comments?
I had eggs for breakfast, by the way.
Thank
But
you,
I didn't
Dillon.
grow
I
them. I bought them.
appreciate that. So comment first, which is, and I'm going to weigh in on the NFL debate here real quick. There's nothing like the Steelers diaspora. So just for the Packers and Lions fans in the room. All kidding aside, though, taking off from what Mary just said, I'm thinking about the 10 years I've spent in Grand Rapids. And when I arrived, a lot of folks talked about how the city was changing or the city's so different and how there's more people moving here. Do you see that playing at us? And I will say, like, right after I moved is right around the time that this book was originally written.
Yeah.
So, are we seeing any patterns? I know you're saying like locked in as far as where we see like home ownership and some based on some of that data, but from your experience and your research into this, like from what I've been told anecdotally is moving in here, is it really changing in any way? And, similar to what Mary said, what can we continue to do about it? Thank you.
How I answered really depends on my mood. So if I'm an optimist, I can say, yeah, we have people coming from a pile of different places, and anytime you have sort of people trying to establish new senses of community and attachment to place, that there's really a great opportunity there of creating new social connections that can be a lot more equitable in there. And so I think anytime you have, particularly a city like Grand Rapids that has an influx of people moving in, um, if those those recursive patterns get played out, that people are coming into from different social backgrounds and social locations, that there's great opportunity for that. So that's the optimist in me. If I didn't sleep well and I'm a pessimist, and the grump in me would say that, are you really seeing change, or are you just going to watch displacement happen in there? And so as people come into communities, which is why we have the concept of gentrification happening, and so people will move in, and then individuals that do live there sort of get pushed out. To your point about how much it costs to rent a place. So the lack of affordable housing really makes things very, very difficult in here. So I used to live, again, in just on the edge of Midtown, just north of the freeway there. And so remember, there's housing that was off of Michigan Street corridor. They built this huge apartment complex there. And so I remember bumping into an acquaintance of my wife as we're walking through the area on our way up towards campus. And she's like, oh, like, saying, how's it going? Like, so we got to know sort of this lady casually there. And she's like, oh, well, the house, or the apartment in the house I was renting just got bought by the people that essentially built that big apartment complex there. And it's like, well, where are you going? And so she doesn't know in here. And so then we were like, keep an eye on what her rent was in that old house compared to what the starting rent was for that apartment complex. There's a remarkable juxtaposition in here. And so who's that sort of renting for is not for people that actually live and were occupying that neighborhood. So that person got displaced somewhere. But I don't think the city does a good job of tracking where that displacement happens and where it goes to. So that definitely needs to be, from a policy sense, part of that. That when you have influx of people moving in, it's great, and there's opportunity, particularly to form new recursive practices that are equitable for everybody. But as long as you're not just simply displacing others to sort of reformulate something that doesn't create that access. So the optimist in me, there's good. I can be a pessimist though too at times. So that's the tension. It's a good question.
Yeah, and I kind of want to add to that, because I've been noticing, and Dr. Carr, kind of like your opinion on this. Um, Grand Rapids is building lots of tiny houses, and where are those houses being built at? On the southeast side. A lot of them are being built in the same neighborhoods. So when we talk about um, um, connecting to and being able to interact with people who are not like us, that is not necessarily happening, especially from a class point of view,
Mm-hmm.
because homeless people who are being given those tiny homes
Mm-hmm.
are going to interact with other people in that neighborhood who are still, low income, who are impacted in the same way that they're being impacted. And then also thinking about outlying and suburban neighborhoods that are fighting against apartment buildings and homes being built out there for homeless people and other people. So they're fighting against that. And so I think the structures are still being practiced. But then also but I'm also thinking about the fact that, okay, a person without a house just wants a house.
Mm-hmm.
And so how do I mean
Yeah.
so how is it that the city is being helpful but harmful at the same time?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if it was an easy problem to solve, like we probably would have worked it out. And so there's so many different threads within that in here. So obviously, one big area is what you're pointing out, something called NIMBYism. So not in my backyard. And so I think a lot of the economic research shows that some of the best successful programs for alleviating sort of intergenerational poverty and creating opportunities is having people with different kind of social class backgrounds being able to live in the same neighborhood together, because it establishes those networks and connections that are absolutely important. Because I think what you described was a perfect illustration of that. These are just this, that's what your social reality is, and you're hanging out with these people, and there's no opportunity for anybody in there. People are just going to get into trouble in here. And it's really creating those broader social connections and possibilities of what it is a motivating thing for people. And a lot of the economic research of moving people through housing vouchers into other neighborhoods is great, but people don't like that, having people from different backgrounds moving into their neighborhood. So they're all for it as long as it's not in my backyard. So that's one element of it. A second one, like, it becomes a cost. And so if it's a purely economic decision, like, we'll build a bunch of small little micro housing in here, but one of the issues with that is that one of the factor of homelessness is lack of connections. And what creates a lack of connections is very small individual isolated household units. So it's economical, you can buy a bunch of cheap housing quickly, but how are you actually integrating those people into of having a support network around them to effectively help them transition out of inconsistent housing states is a lot harder to do in here. I remember seeing one classic applied where building housing on Native American reservations, where they were having these tiny little kitchens in these houses. And when they actually started talking to people they're building housing for, you're like, you need a big industrial kitchen, because part of my culture is I'm going to cook for everybody in there. And so building housing that fits within cultural attitudes and practices is necessary. And when you have designers of housing building that for communities that they don't have any on the ground of firsthand ethnographic knowledge of, you're going to get a disconnect with that. So housing is housing, but a house is not a home. And so you really want to construct homes for people, because those are where people are creating enduring connections. And that's a little bit more of kind of a subjective type of thing that really requires kind of partnering with people on the ground, ask them what they want and what they need and what's going to work within those communities to hopefully overcome sort of the NIMBYism. But the way in which we do housing policy doesn't work that way, because somebody ultimately wants to kind of make a profit off of that in some way, shape, or form, which is why we lack starter homes in this part of, or not just part of the state, this entire state, because a builder could build a $200,000 home, but there's zonings that affect it. And then two, the profit margins on it for a builder is so small, and so you're not going to build it. But that doesn't allow people to transition out of essentially of renting to find that, because you're only going to have huge $500,000 homes in a market, which first-time homeowners don't have access to. So there's a lot of subtle little things that are built into that make it a really complex problem in there. So.
I think if we actually start investigating like the housing policies in Grand Rapids, we will probably see a lot of corruption. Like I have this like ideology that because the same people that like are the nonprofit organizations and are donors to them are the same people that are buying up all of these houses
Mhm.
and charging the rent 3 times the rent. And so they're making money on both ends. They're making money
Yeah.
from their nonprofit, and then they're making their money from like keeping like making the rent higher and keeping black people out.
Mhm.
Like it's a genuine thing because I experienced that like when I was trying to look for a place. It's not because I don't work. It's not because I'm not trying to better my life. It's just really because of these systems are like keeping me out of it. And it's like, how is this the same people that are selling houses are shaking hands and having dinner with the same people that are profiting off of people being homeless?
Mhm.
And I think that's why it's like a harder barrier because I really do feel like it's like something going on with there. Because there's no like if you look at the average income of people like in this inner city of Grand Rapids, is
Mhm.
no way your housing requirement should be 3 times the rent.
Absolutely.
I was one apartment I went to, and I was like, I was crying
Yeah.
because I'm like, I would never want to live in this dirty apartment, and it was still 3 times the rent.
Three
Nobody
times.
even wants to live in this place.
Yeah. And that's, I think, why the book that was chosen this year is a really great read for there, because you're hearing stories of people that were encountering those types of structural inequalities, not necessarily housing, but other things in their life, and we're really of grinding against that, finding ways to sort of organize and draw connections and vocalizing like this isn't right and this is what I see as problematic. And the more you can do that, then hopefully that creates at least an awareness or an idea that other people, a nonprofit would come in to say, hey, let's do housing differently in that regard in here. And um, so that's sort of my appeal is looking at as you read the book, like what was working for people in one particular sort of issue that they're working on, and can I replicate that in terms of the issues that one matter to me, but two are affecting my day-to-day experience as well.
Any other questions or comments? Oh, okay, well, we'll end it right there. Can we give Dr. Carr a round of applause? Don't forget that next week, our program, same time, same place, is going to be Voices of Pride, exploring the history of the LGBTQIA activism in Grand Rapids. And we're going to have 2 moderators for that program and 4 panelists. And they're going to be talking about the history of Pride in Grand Rapids. So come back next week, Wednesday, for our next event surrounding the campus common reading. And then on April 6th, that's the Monday after Easter, we're going to have the editors of the book here, and they're going to be talking about why they chose Grand Rapids as a place to explore. And they're going to be talking about some of their favorite stories and some of their favorite essays and things in the book. So make sure you also plan to attend that event, same time, same place. And then look forward to our schedule for our second phase of the Campus Coming Reading that will be coming out in May. So thank you for coming and have a good day.